Hi, I'm Steve Packard, and welcome to Cyber Risk Analysis. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at access control, and we're going to be looking at specifically business email compromise as a case study in access control. Now, account takeover causes more than 90% of cybersecurity problems. An account takeover is not a good thing. It means that, as the name implies, someone has taken over your account. Business email compromise is when someone has taken over a business email account. So that could be the account of anybody, but they will frequently go for the high rollers, CEOs and CISOs, and also for those who have the ability to make changes to the system, such as administrators, and those who can make financial transactions. This isn't good at all. I mean, stop and think about it. It's just creepy to think about these bad guys getting into all kinds of business email. Your business email, your senator's business email, your lawyers, your doctors, your accountants. It's really not a good thing. The other thing is that you may have noticed that your email account could get you into almost anything. After all, if you can't get into one of your accounts, they will send you a password reset to your email. So that's not good. Business email compromise is done for a few reasons. And those are primarily A, as a vector to installing ransomware, because once you get that business email account, you can get into other accounts. You can socially engineer your way into things. Number two, to perpetrate fraudulent fund transfer. That's definitely a thing. Number three, to utilize that email account in some greater scam, like some ongoing phishing scam or something like that. If you have an email address that is trusted at a major supplier or vendor, you're going to be able to get through most phishing filters. And then finally, just for espionage and exfiltrating data. That's what business email accounts are used for, and that's what business email accounts are breached for. So that's why business email compromise is so dangerous, and really it just sends chills up your spine to think about it, because business email compromise is very common, but it shouldn't be. It's never okay, it's never excusable, it's always preventable. Just like every cybersecurity incident, they're always preventable. It's also probably simpler than you think to prevent it, and more intuitive once you get to know it. So let's take a look at business email compromise and exactly how it works, how it goes down, and what our resources are to stop business email compromise from happening. Now, I'm not kidding when I say that business email compromise should absolutely never happen. I mean, really, if we can't secure our emails, we're going to have to go back to snail mail or fax or something, because email is a vital communication service. Whether or not it should be is another question, but it is. And there's a lot of very sensitive data that is exchanged by email. Also, business email compromise typically takes months to detect, which is even creepier. But what is email really? Well, corporate email is a service that lives on a server. Like all IT services, there is a server. Now, that server could be a real server that's actually bare metal. It could be a virtual server, and it could be a server that exists in a corporate data center, a shared data center, or it could also exist these days usually at a cloud provider. But regardless of where that server is, it is in a data center that is in the United States. Or if not the United States, another allied country. Doesn't matter if it's the US, Japan, the UK, the EU. We can work with all those guys. They're on our side. So that should be a problem. We own that. We own the data center. Either the corporation does, or its cloud service provider or other managed service provider. And it is in an area that we control. So we can put whatever we want in that data center. So let's see what we can put in there. We could have some reserve systems so that if the main system goes down, or if we're suspicious of it, we could always take it offline to investigate, pull one of those reserve systems. We're going to maintain some activity logs, some backups to make sure everything is good and hasn't been altered. And if it has been, we can restore it. We're going to have an auditor, maybe a whole team of auditors. They're going to be looking over everything to make sure everything is done correctly. We're going to have security guards, maybe physical security guards, maybe also IT and network security guards. And we could also throw in some AI, because these days we want to use AI for everything, right? So that's everything we can put in the data center and anything else. It is our data center on our turf, and we make the rules here. Also, that connection belongs to us. That is a natural pinch point. And that's both the connection to the data center and to the server itself. And so we can make whoever dials into that server from the internet, we can make them go through whatever infrastructure we want. Firewalls, multiple firewalls, IDS, intrusion detection system. There's nothing that we can't put on this. This is our turf. This is our connection. And anything that we want to interrogate a connection with, we can do. Now, we have an employee. In this case, we're going to say the CEO. And he needs to get at his email. How can we allow him to get at his email without bad guys getting at it too? Well, maybe he's at our office when he gets at the email, so we don't even have to have him go over the internet. If he's at the office, we can hardwire it right into the data center. In fact, the data center could be in the same building if we want to go real old school. That office building is in the United States, and we can add as much security to it as we want. So if that CEO or any employee needs to come into the office, badge in, go up the elevator, say hi to everybody, and go into his locked office and get on there, well, that's pretty much good enough for most situations. In fact, that's the best security you could have, and it is appropriate for many situations. It is underutilized too. But that's really not going to cut it for everything. Sure, maybe if he's the loan officer at a bank that's doing corporate loan at that moment, he should have to go into his office. But in most cases, no, that's not going to cut it these days. So what else could we do to allow him some remote access from his home or when he's on the road? Well, we could use webmail, just a website, and have him log into that with his name and his password. But, geez, despite the fact that most companies actually do have this and most email account systems do have this and they actually sell it as sort of a feature, I'm going to say no. I do not like the idea of just having webmail. Again, most companies, most institutions do have webmail, but you just got to go to a website. I'm not comfortable with that. You might wonder why exactly do companies have webmail? And there are a couple of reasons for it. First, it's just a legacy thing. See, this photo here, you see people at a hotel in a reading room on computers. And years ago, before universal 4G, before we all had smartphones, before laptops were so ubiquitous, there were cyber cafes, people went to libraries. And when you were traveling, maybe you used your family's computer, but that's just not necessary anymore. So we really don't need to make it available from the whole web unless there's a special case, or maybe we're just making our priorities that we want them to get to it. We want accessibility to be there. We're afraid that he might lose his phone or something. But in any case, I don't think there should be web email, at least not for corporations and not for important government agencies. But there is old-fashioned thinking there, and there's also the fact that, well, by default, Office 365 email is available as webmail, and 90% of companies use Office 365. I'm not trying to pick on Microsoft here or anything. It's just that they've decided to go to a cloud-native ecosystem, and because they like selling Office 365, they want it to be as easy as possible. So rather than having to install software on everyone's computer, and if they wanted you to use only your corporate devices, then you would have to do a little bit more work. But by having it available on the web, it's no effort at all, and you could just sign up for the service, and then anyone in your company or your institution could use it. And I should say also that it is more difficult to maintain access control when you have an irregular group of people. It's one thing if you have a group of employees, but then when you have temps and contractors, or maybe you're a school and you have students, or you're a big company with many customers, and you want your customers to have secure access, that does become a lot more difficult because you don't have the same level of control of them. But when we're talking about business email compromise, almost by definition, it is going to be employees, and often it will be high-ranking employees because their email address is worth the most. Okay, so we're back here. What else can we use? Well, we could use his own personal devices or any other available devices, and we'll use those good old-fashioned formats that I grew up with, SMTP, IMAP, POP3. Those are just some old, not very secure email connection protocols, but not sure I like that either. I mean, those look like kind of old devices, and if he can get on them with his devices, then that's probably going to mean that anyone else can too, so that's no good. What else can we use? Oh, that works. Corporate-owned devices. Yeah, that works. I'm happy with that. We all happy with that? If he has to own the device, if it's something the corporation gave him, that ought to be secure. Well, fair enough, it is. The thing is, that does require some overhead. You have to put in some effort to monitor the devices, to audit them, and to make sure that you have the right device ID. But even so, it's less than 100% because there are ways of device spoofing. And if you implement it in strictly software with cookies and tokens, those can be stolen. And there are also potential social engineering ways, like trying to convince that CEO to let you dial onto his laptop and use that as a jumping off point. So this isn't necessarily in and of itself always going to be perfect if you don't have the implementation down well, but there's more that we could use here. We are in the United States, and we could use U.S. infrastructure. So we could have an independent direct network connection. We could work with Verizon or T-Mobile to do some last mile verification. Now, that has its limitations too. If we're using the cell phone network, if we're using SMS, that can be a limitation right there because SMS is not very secure. There are SIM card swapping attacks. There are also social engineering attacks that might be able to trick someone in the U.S. into giving a code that comes from the independent network. But we have this to work with for sure. We also can send him home with any devices we want. He's our CEO. He's our employee. If we want to send him home with an envelope filled with secret passcodes or a passcode generator or smart cards or a special VPN router, yeah, sure. It's our turf. We make the rules here. We can send him home with whatever we want. Additionally, we could collect some biometric data like his fingerprints or his face image or his voice. We could use that too, although we might have to be careful with that because we have to have biometrics that meets privacy standards, which is a thing that you have to worry about now. And then also, your biometrics might be device dependent. It might require that your device have a certain type of camera or fingerprint scanner, and they might not all have that. And the other thing is that there are ways of spoofing this. If you could get an image of him or create a deep fake. So this isn't perfect, but none of these are perfect. Still, they're all pretty good. These are all pretty good options, and if we work with them correctly, any one of them should be able to secure. But then again, remember, in cybersecurity, we want to have defense in depth. We don't just want one control because none of these are 100% reliable. But then again, if he's on a VPN router and he has to use a smart card and a one-time password with a corporate-owned device, and we're going to send a signal through the cell network, that's going to be pretty tough. That's going to be pretty tough for anyone to beat. But wait, there's more we can do. How about we add one more thing to the data center? A honeypot. Was a honeypot? Well, it looks just like the email server that the bad guys would be trying to get on, but they would find that one first, and it will just ring an alarm bell and it will log their activity, and it could send them on wild goose chases too. In fact, we could have some fun with that using AI. We could generate all kinds of fake stuff to trip them up. But yeah, a honeypot, that's another really powerful control. So remember, this is our turf and we own and control everything. We make the rules here. We can add any device we want. We can add any service we want. Budget is really the only limit. The only thing we don't have control of here is the internet. And that internet could allow somebody else to connect. For example, Boris and Natasha. They both want to pretend that they're the CEO. They want to spoof his identity and they want to get into his corporate email address because of course they do. Well, what tools do they have to work with? So they have phishing, social engineering. They might have a compromised password. Maybe his password was compromised elsewhere. Maybe he uses the same password for everything. Many people do. They could try guessing his password, and you'd be surprised how frequently that works. Or they could just password spray. They could try common passwords with every single email address that we use at this company. They might not get the CEOs, but they'll get one of them, and they could use that then for some social engineering. So they could go after passwords using any of those methods. They could also use account recovery guessing, and that's why it's so terrible to have these account recovery things like who was your favorite teacher and what's your dog's name and what's your favorite type of soup or something like that, because you could probably socially engineer those or even guess those. So yeah, those are how they get compromised account. They could also try going after MFA. We might have MFA enabled, but they might be able to use account recovery through MFA bombing. That's something that we're going to talk about. They could also use a weak MFA implementation. Maybe the MFA is there, but there's some way of getting through it because it has an option of disabling it. Maybe the MFA is there, but it puts a token or a cookie on your computer, and there's a way of intercepting that. And then finally, there are unpatched vulnerabilities in 0 days. But they don't have any actual access to any of the other stuff here. They can't get at our data center. They can't get into his house and steal those devices or any of those other security measures that we sent home with him. They can't get onto our local U.S. infrastructure. They might be able to spoof where they're located and make it seem like they're in the U.S. by bouncing their connection off of a VPN or a proxy. But ultimately, everything here, other than the internet, we do own and we do control, either the U.S. or our partners or this company itself. So this doesn't seem like a fair fight just yet. It does seem like the defenders have a huge advantage here. Well, what else do Boris and Natasha have? Well, they also have AI, because AI is available to everyone these days. We don't really know what their AI could do, but it could do a lot of things. And that includes, they might be able to create deep fakes of the CEO. So that biometric data, if they could intercept that, they might be able to create a video of him, or they might even be able to do that from his social media. They can clone his voice. They might even be able to clone his fingerprints or his retina. So we do have to be careful. They have AI and they have the potential for deep fakes. But if it makes it easier, just remember, corporate email or any other service, any other IT service, is really just a server with a connection. There's a natural pinch point here, both physically and logically. Everybody comes in through that cable, and we can interrogate that connection any way we want. So telling who is the CEO and who is Boris and Natasha, we have quite a few options as they both cross that one pinch point. You may have been wondering as well, could we just monitor things continuously in real time? Could we just keep an eye on that? Maybe we're really paranoid and we can't keep our eyes off of it. I know I am. Well, yes, we can do that. We can. And in fact, if we did, we might see something like this. However, it wouldn't be quite as well formatted for readability. The server logs are generally a bit more verbose than this. But surprisingly, they're pretty easy to read most of the time. And you will see things like this, like the CEO giving his, I'll be out of office at 2 p.m. He signs out, and then what do we have here? First, they try the wrong password, and then, oh boy, after a few trial and errors, they get through. Yeah, this is something that you might see. And it absolutely can be monitored in real time, or it can be monitored in not quite real time. You could use AI or other automated systems here to only flag the more suspicious connections. That's something you could do. You might also have individuals who work for you who are tasked with doing this, but they don't do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Maybe you're tolerant to have a connection breached for a short period of time because the bad guys don't usually use it right away for all of their nefarious purposes. So you might have analysts who come in the next day to look at the server logs if there's anything suspicious and figure out what's going on. This is called a SOC center, or just SOC, Security Operations Center. Like ATM machine, calling it a SOC center is a little bit redundant. But they do have them, and they do exist. It is absolutely possible to monitor it in any environment in real time. It does require a fully staffed SOC, and yeah, that is kind of expensive. But this is already done by some high-value organizations. For example, banks. It can be absolutely expensive. It can be very expensive, but it's cheaper than being hacked. It really is. And there is room for compromise. As I said, you don't need to strictly do it 24/7. It also exists as a service. That can be helpful as well. You could sign up for a service provider to provide your SOC, and they have elasticity because they can share that SOC with other clients of theirs, and that makes everything better. Because as we know, the demand goes up and down for any sort of security monitoring service like that. So SOC as a service exists. Getting different companies together to help with that elasticity exists. Having a little bit of compromise that you're not doing it 24/7, that's an option too. There's also DLP. That can be very effective if that is implemented correctly. And DLP is data leak prevention. And data leak prevention is all about monitoring the egresses from your network and monitoring endpoints. So with DLP, you're monitoring for anything suspicious, anything in the email that looks like a social security number, anything in the email that looks like trade secrets, anything in the email that appears to be a very large attachment. It doesn't just have to be email either. It could be other means of exfiltration. So DLP can be very helpful. And when you think about it, that's actually the way that you would do it with any security, because this kind of monitoring can be done temporarily as a mitigation, and it is a near perfect mitigation if you do it correctly. So if you have a 0-day that you don't have a patch for, or you've just merged with a company and you're not sure about their IT infrastructure, for whatever reason you're uncertain of your IT infrastructure, you can use a SOC center and temporary monitoring, although it is labor intensive, to actually achieve near perfect security if it is fine-grained and fastidious enough. And just think about it. If we had this problem here, imagine we had a shop and somebody smashed the front window of the door. Well, that doesn't look good. Somebody could break in. The doorknob and the lock appear to be broken. And we probably can't order a new door today, so what are we going to do? How are we going to leave this place tonight? Ah, well, that works. In fact, now we're even more secure than we were before. But I'm kind of paranoid, and that guy, how do we know we can trust that guy? Well, that's even better. So yeah, that is how you would guard a situation in the physical world when you had a temporary security problem or you had a temporary uncertainty in your security. And that is also how you do it in the cyber world. Let's go back to places that do have and don't have SOCs. Big four accounting firms, financial sector firms, traditional government agencies such as IRS, Federal Reserve, banks and telecommunications companies, but that's pretty much it. As I said, it can be kind of expensive. And so most healthcare, you'll almost never see this in healthcare. The only place you might is a very large, well-funded hospital. Like if it's the Mayo Clinic or Yale New Haven, they might. Although even then, I'm not sure because it isn't in any way a ubiquitous thing in hospitals. It's only really a ubiquitous thing at like the big four, certain defense contractors, banks, the IRS, the Federal Reserve. Yeah, they do have that, but few others do. And also, Microsoft apparently has a very deficient SOC because they haven't been able to catch a number of things that they should have been able to. And also, it is worth noting that it can be a big help, but it has to be adequately staffed. And one thing is that the staff has to be given a mandate. They have to be allowed to interrupt business processes if they see a security problem. Now, it may have occurred to you that if it's 100% possible to end the attacks by monitoring them continuously, why don't we do that? Our hospitals are being attacked left and right. It doesn't take a lot of skill to just investigate whether or not a connection that was supposed to be to the US is actually to Russia. Doesn't take all that much effort. Being a SOC analyst is a great starting point. So if we really wanted to, there's no talent gap issue here. Any idiot who knows the basics of IT could, in fact, be a SOC analyst. Then we could, in fact, do this. We could dispatch the National Guard. We could declare a state of emergency. We could stop almost any security problem, even if there is a gap at the moment, by just instituting a comprehensive SOC center as a mitigating control in the meantime. So why don't we do this? Well, basically nobody seems to care, or it's not a high priority. I should be a little bit more fair than that. There's more to it than that, of course. There's also the fact that we're kind of dealing with a lot of risk fatigue coming out of COVID and with the political situation. I mean, the federal government is just in political deadlock. And above all else, I think nobody wants to deal with cybersecurity. It's not their issue. They don't want to make it their issue. No senator or congressman cares enough to make it their issue and say something radical like, let's deploy the National Guard to our hospitals to keep our patients safe and keep this vital national resource safe. Nobody wants to make a splash like that. Nobody wants to spend the money. No hospital or healthcare clinic, no major insurance company such as United Healthcare, they don't care enough to implement a SOC center and do continuous monitoring and do it correctly. So they might have a SOC center, but if they do, it's not properly staffed. And it's sad and all, but it's really not anything other than a lack of will to do this. It truly is a lack of will. It's also worth noting that SOC centers are extremely photogenic. I mean, you can make them look like mission control, and that can get everybody charged and jazzed too. It's also great for just your cybersecurity photos. That's not even a very impressive looking one. You can totally build out a SOC center to look just like NORAD. Not that that matters, but so if defenders have such an advantage on business email compromise, if it really is a system we own on our turf where we make the rules and we own all the resources, everyone who designed this is on our side. Everyone who operates it is on our side. Everyone who monitors it, the standard setters, they're all on our side. We ought to be able to stop this. There is a huge advantage to being a defender, and business email compromise is not rocket science to stop dead in its tracks. So why does it keep happening? Well, basically, email is a very valuable service to a hacker. As I mentioned, you can reset almost anything. You could spoof almost anyone's identity. If you get something from somebody's legit email, you're going to assume it's them. You can get through phishing. It's just very valuable. It's very valuable for ransomware. It's very valuable for intelligence. It's very valuable for almost everything. And emails mostly use just passwords. It's very common. The logins are easy to find for email. They're easy to guess too. It's just your email address, and that's going to be public, or it'll generally be your first initial last name at your company. That's the most common corporate email address. So they're going to know the login. The email servers are inherently connected to the internet. They have to be. And email is frequently accessed through Office 365, which is really terrible, but it is. Microsoft owns about 90% of the enterprise email, and Microsoft, by default, will have it available on the web. Also, Microsoft does not require you to have strong MFA. They allow you to have no MFA whatsoever. They give the customer a lot of control over how much or how little security they have, and for most customers, that's not a good thing because they have no idea what they're doing. It's very rarely is it bound to a device. Very rarely is it tightly bound to a corporate device. Very rarely is there strong MFA associated with a single controlled phone. And that's just because it can be cumbersome. If you're going to do it that way, you have to have an IT asset inventory. You have to implement it correctly. You have to manage those devices. You have to keep track of them. It's easier to just have everybody have an unmanaged, uncontrolled device. And if you run out of devices or one breaks, you can just take the corporate card down to Staples and buy the next laptop that you like. Having completely unmanaged devices is easier. It is less cumbersome. It's rarely monitored. You would think at government agencies, you would think at Microsoft, it would be fastidiously monitored in detail, but it is not. It just isn't. And that's because it costs money. And they're rarely willing to pay for that. They're rarely willing to pay for anything other than the most basic email. Most companies use the most basic email with no security features whatsoever. It's also worth noting that many companies do run old email servers. There are some very old email servers out there. And Microsoft Exchange and a few other email servers, they've had a lot of unpatched vulnerabilities out there. Or there are a lot of vulnerabilities out there, and a lot of servers are unpatched because nobody really cares about their email. Nobody really cares about their email server. It just keeps plugging along, out of sight and out of mind. Your email server might be years old because email hasn't changed a whole lot in the past 20, even 30 years. It really hasn't. And because of that, many companies do have very obsolete email servers and very obsolete practices with relation to their email servers. And nobody really ever pays attention to their email. People don't check their outboxes for suspicious activity. They're not looking at logs. If your email were to say, you logged on at 3 o'clock last night, you'd probably say, well, that's funny. I don't remember logging on at 3 o'clock. Must have been sleepwalking. But very few people keep an eye on things. So just to recap, the reasons that business email is compromised is to install ransomware, to phish trusted third parties, to perpetrate fund transfer fraud, that's often invoice fraud, and then just for other fraudulent uses, to fake their identity, to pretend that they're somebody else, to steal whatever data or delete whatever data. They can exfiltrate data, they can wreak havoc on an organization or a trusted third party by spoofing being somebody who's trusted within that email account and who is the verified CEO or some other trusted party. So what techniques do they use to get past these? Well, phishing, and the reason is defenses are weak. Very few companies go all out on the phishing defenses. Very few institutions do. Many have no phishing protection whatsoever. Passwords are reused and they may be compromised anywhere. Oh yeah, people reuse the same password in many different places. Passwords can sometimes be guessed, as I touched on. Email accounts frequently do not have MFA protection. I think there was recently a study that said about 40% of corporate email does not have any MFA protection, or it's optional, and it should never be optional. Passwords can sometimes just be guessed. People often use passwords that are so obvious or so common. If you use password 123, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, you will get onto a surprising number of corporate email addresses. Ideally, though, you want to use phishing-resistant MFA or phishing-resistant security tokens. Those are like USB keys or single-time password generators, but very, very few use that, very few. Also, federated identity and single sign-on is often weakly implemented, and that's just because it makes it easier to sign on to a lot of accounts by having weakly implemented SSO and federated identity. And very few companies or organizations are willing to pay the price to actually have an expert make sure that it is done properly. MFA bombing is effective. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And account recovery options are usually terrible. They're usually something like, tell me your first grade teacher's name or something like that. I've also seen account recovery that only requires your social security number. And it even can bypass the MFA. You could say, I don't have my device or password, but I have my social security number. Well, gee, that's really secure because we know those things haven't leaked all over the place. Really, really, really. It's actually pretty amazing to think that in this day and age, anyone would think that a social security number were so hard to obtain and so good a verification that if you had that, and maybe you had somebody's first grade teacher and the restaurant that they liked the most, that you would be able to stop anyone else from getting onto their account. It's kind of crazy, but there are a lot of places that operate that way, and they really do not want to have to put the effort into changing anything. It's just companies do not like to do stuff that is outside of their mainline business. That's absolutely the case. Nobody wants to take ownership of this. That's absolutely the case. Nobody wants to spend any money. That's absolutely the case. It's really sad. There is no will to change this. If there were, we could. If you want a little bit of a deeper explanation as to why companies like Microsoft, why these IT companies that ought to be technical experts, why this happens, well, it has a lot to do with the kind of market forces of capitalism. Microsoft is not a security company. Microsoft is a general purpose software company. Some of their big lines of business include games for Xbox. They make a lot of money on their Xbox platform. They also provide consumer software. They provide cloud services. They provide all kinds of products for business. And now they're in the AI game. These are all things that they're trying to dispatch very quickly. Companies that make consumer products in competitive markets, in high-tech markets where there's a short product pipeline, there's a short time before they have to get it to market before a competitor will outdo them. Companies like that have a very hard time having a good risk management and security culture. It's just because of the nature of the business that they're in, the nature of the business that they're used to. That is really at odds with having a good security mindset. And we see this all over the place. It's not a new problem either. But really, one of the issues is that in consumer-facing businesses, having no risk management at all will reward you financially until the day it doesn't. But if your competitors don't have any risk management and they're just rushing their product to market, they probably will beat you. And they probably will be just fine until the day they're not. So you can see the incentives here just aren't that good. We need better incentivization. We need it to come from the proper areas, from the risk management experts, places like credit reporting and corporate credit agencies like S&P and Dow Jones and Bloomberg, these organizations that report on businesses and investment information. We need it from mutual funds. We need mutual funds to work harder to vet the companies that they invest in, and individual investors and advisors. We need, above all else, insurance companies. Insurance companies have to hold companies' feet to the fire with their risk management. So do government agencies. It's also worth noting that email servers are rarely serviced in any way. They garner less attention than other services. They tend to be some of the oldest servers out there. If you have a server in your closet that is 25 years old and you're still using it, it's probably an email server. Most email servers lack basic security measures, especially if they're old. If they're an older email server, you probably never worried about anything like this back in the 1990s. And believe it or not, there are some out there that are, in fact, that old. And they frequently have unpatched vulnerabilities. Remember, as I said, email hasn't changed a whole lot. There are no new features. It's pretty transparent user experience which email server you have. So they are, in fact, some of the worst servers out there. So that's part one of Business Email Compromise, a case study in access control. There'll be more coming up soon, but this is already pretty long. If you like this content, because this channel is new, you can help us grow by subscribing and clicking that bell. You can also like, and you can tell your friends and spread the word. And I hope you do, because we're all on the same side here, and we're all just trying to keep our country and our society and everybody else around us cyber safe. I'm Steve Packard, and this is Cyber Risk Analysis.